Sarah Thompson leaned back in the driver's seat, staring at the dense forest ahead. The trees seemed to rise like sentinels, their tops lost in the low-hanging mist. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, combing through archives, interviewing locals, and tracing the threads of the Harper family's disappearance. Mark, her boyfriend and a wildlife photographer, sat beside her, scrolling on his phone. Are we really doing this? Driving into the middle of nowhere to talk to some hermit about a 70-year-old mystery? Sarah glanced at him, her lips twitching into a smirk. You didn't have to come, you know. Mark rolled his eyes. Please. If I didn't come, you'd probably walk into some Blair Witch situation, and I'd never see you again. She laughed softly, but her expression turned serious. Mark, this isn't just another story to me. The Harpers' disappearance. There's something about it that doesn't add up. No bodies, no signs of struggle, just gone. Mark sighed, setting his phone aside. And you think this Jack Davis guy has the answers? I think he knows more than he's told anyone, Sarah said. He was part of the search team. If there's even a chance he can help, I have to try. The dirt road ended at a small clearing. In the center stood a weathered cabin, its wood darkened by decades of rain and snow. A rusty pickup truck sat parked under a lean-to, and smoke curled lazily from the chimney. Quaint, Mark muttered, stepping out of the car. You sure this guy isn't going to greet us with a shotgun? Sarah shot him a look. Be nice. Before they could approach, the cabin door creaked open, and a tall, wiry man stepped onto the porch. Jack Davis looked to be in his late 70s, with sharp blue eyes and a face etched by time and hard living. He eyed them warily, a cigarette dangling from his lips. You, Sarah? He called, his voice rough. Yes, she replied, walking toward him with her hand extended. Thank you for agreeing to meet us. Jack ignored her hand, glancing at Mark. You didn't say you were bringing company. He's with me, Sarah said quickly. Mark's just here to help. Jack grunted. Help, huh? Well, don't touch anything and don't ask stupid questions. He turned and disappeared back into the cabin, leaving the door open. Mark raised an eyebrow. Friendly guy? Come on, Sarah said, pulling him along. Jack poured himself a cup of coffee, the faint clink of his spoon against the cup, the only sound for a moment. It was October 1956. I was a young man then, barely out of high school. That search, it was like nothing I've ever been part of since. Mark leaned forward, arms crossed on the table. What made it so different? Jack took a slow sip, then set the cup down. It wasn't just the fact that we didn't find anything. It was how wrong the whole thing felt. Like the mountains didn't want us there. The animals were quiet, the air heavy. Every time we thought we were close to a clue, it slipped through our ears, like chasing shadows. Sarah scribbled in her notebook, her voice steady but urgent. You mentioned over the phone that you found something unusual during the search. Can you tell us more? Jack hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the map on the wall. Finally, he stood, pulled a small box from a shelf, and set it on the table. He opened it, revealing faded newspaper clippings, photographs, and a small battered leather journal. This was Lily Harper's, he said, his voice quieter now. Found it near their campsite. It's the only solid thing we ever recovered. Sarah carefully picked up the journal, her fingers trembling slightly. The pages were filled with childish handwriting, sketches of trees and animals, and notes about the family's trip. Look at the last entry, Jack said. Sarah flipped to the final page. The handwriting was hurried, the lines slightly crooked. They're singing again. It's beautiful, but scary. Tommy thinks it's coming from the trees, but Dad says it's just the wind. I don't think we're alone out here. I think they're watching us. Mom said we'll leave tomorrow, but I don't think they'll let us. Mark leaned over her shoulder, reading aloud. Singing? Watching? Who are they? Jack's face darkened. That's the question, isn't it? We found strange carvings near their campsite, symbols etched into the trees. Never seen anything like them before or since. Eyes lit up. Do you have photos? Jack nodded, rummaging through the box and pulling out a faded black and white photo. The image showed a tree with intricate, almost otherworldly runes carved into its bark. Mark frowned. Couldn't that just be graffiti? Some hikers leaving marks? Jack shook his head. Not in the 50s, and not in the middle of nowhere. Those carvings weren't made by any normal hands. The plan. Can you take us to the Harpers' campsite? Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack's eyes narrowed. You don't want to go there. Yes, I do, Sarah insisted. If I'm going to figure out what happened, I need to see it for myself. Jack sighed, rubbing his temples. You don't understand. People who go poking around up there don't always come back. Or if they do, they're different. Mark scoffed. Different how? Jack leaned forward, his voice low and steady. Like they've seen something they can't explain. They're never the same. Some stop talking altogether. Others don't last long. Sarah met his gaze, unflinching. I'll take that risk, Mark groaned. Sarah, come on. Mark, she cut him off, her tone firm. You can stay here if you want, but I'm going. Jack sighed, clearly reluctant. Fine, we leave at first light. Into the woods. The morning was cold and gray as they set off. Jack led the way, his rifle slung over one shoulder. Sarah followed, her camera and notebook in hand, with Mark bringing up the rear, grumbling under his breath. The deeper they went into the forest, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The towering trees blocked out most of the sunlight, and the air felt unnaturally still. Mark broke the silence. So, Jack, do you believe all the stories? The singing? The watchers? Jack glanced back at him. I don't believe, I know. I've heard the singing myself. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. What does it sound like? Jack's expression hardened. Like a lullaby, but wrong. Too perfect. Too human, but not. Mark rolled his eyes. Great, creepy ghost choir. Just what I needed. The Harpers' campsite. By mid-afternoon, they reached the site. Jack stopped abruptly, motioning for them to be quiet. The remains of the fire pit were still visible, along with the faint outlines of where the tents had been. Sarah immediately began taking photos and jotting notes. This is it, she murmured. Mark wandered over to the trees. Are these the carvings you were talking about? He called, pointing to the strange symbols etched into the bark. Jack nodded. Don't touch them. Mark pulled his hand back. Why not? Jack's gaze was intense. Because we don't know what they mean, or what they're tied to. Sarah crouched near the fire pit, brushing away leaves and dirt. Her fingers closed around something cold and metallic. She held it up, a rusted locket. Opening it, she found a tiny photo of a young girl. This must have been Lily's, she whispered. Before anyone could respond, a faint melody drifted through the air. The three of them froze. Sarah, Mark whispered, gripping her arm. Tell me that's just the wind. But Sarah couldn't speak. The sound was hauntingly beautiful, like a choir of voices singing in perfect harmony. It sent shivers down her spine, yet she couldn't look away from the trees. Jack's voice cut through the spell. We need to leave, now. The humming grew louder, the air around them seeming to vibrate with the sound. The forest felt alive, the shadows shifting. Run, Jack shouted. The haunting melody swelled around them, growing louder with each step they took. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It felt like the forest itself was alive, vibrating with the song. The trees seemed to shift subtly, their trunks twisting as if to block their path. Shadows. Jack led the way, his rifle clutched tightly in his hands. "Stay close," he barked, his voice cutting through the cacophony. Sarah stumbled over a root, her breath ragged as she tried to keep up. "What is it? What's chasing us?" "I don't know," Jack shouted back. "And I don't want to find out." Mark grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her upright. "Come on, we have to move." Behind them, the singing shifted. No longer a beautiful, hypnotic melody, it became discordant, angry. The voices rose and fell in unnatural harmonies, creating an oppressive wall of sound. "They're getting closer," Sarah yelled, panic creeping into her voice. A branch snapped nearby, and Mark turned just in time to see something move between the trees. It was tall, humanoid, but impossibly thin, its elongated limbs blending with the shadows. Its eyes glowed faintly, like embers in the darkness. "Go!" Mark screamed, pushing Sarah forward. The creature stepped into the clearing behind them, its movements fluid and unnerving, as if it was bending the very space around it. More figures emerged from the trees, their shapes indistinct but undeniably watching, stalking. Jack stopped and raised his rifle. "Keep running!" he shouted, aiming at the nearest figure. The gunshot shattered the air, echoing through the forest. For a moment, the singing faltered, the harmony breaking apart. The creatures hesitated, their glowing eyes flickering. Jack fired again, and the figures retreated slightly, melting back into the shadows. "Move, now!" he yelled, his voice raw. The trio sprinted through the woods, the undergrowth tearing at their legs. The air grew thicker, harder to breathe, as if the forest itself was closing in on them. Sarah glanced over her shoulder and saw the shadows moving again, faster now. The creatures didn't run. They glided, their bodies shifting in and out of focus like mirages. "What are they?" she gasped. Jack's voice was grim. "Not people, not animals. Something older, something this place doesn't want us to understand." The ground beneath them began to feel unstable, shifting with every step. Roots writhed like snakes, reaching for their ankles. Mark tripped, falling hard onto the ground. "Mark!" Sarah screamed, turning back. One of the creatures lunged toward him, its claw-like hand extending unnaturally. Mark scrambled backward, kicking wildly. "Get it off me!" Jack fired again, the bullet grazing the creature. It recoiled with a guttural hiss, retreating into the darkness. "Get up!" Jack barked, grabbing Mark by the arm and hauling him to his feet. Sarah pulled Mark forward, her own fear momentarily forgotten. "Come on, we're almost there." As they neared the edge of the forest, the singing shifted once more. It became a low, mournful wail, like a lament for something lost. The sound tugged at Sarah's mind, filling her with an overwhelming sense of despair. She slowed, turning to look back. The creatures had stopped chasing them, standing motionless in the shadows. Their glowing eyes seemed to watch her, pleading. "Sarah!" Mark shouted, grabbing her arm. "Don't stop!" "But they're not attacking," she murmured, her voice distant. Jack ran back, shaking her roughly. "That's how they get you. Keep moving or you're dead." The spell broke and Sarah stumbled forward, tears streaming down her face. "What do they want?" Jack didn't answer, his jaw tight. They burst out of the forest and into the clearing where the car was parked. The singing stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Sarah bent over, gasping for air. Mark leaned against the car, his hands shaking. Jack stood by the edge of the trees, his rifle still raised, scanning the shadows. "Are they gone?" Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jack didn't answer immediately. "They don't leave. They're always watching, but they won't come out of the trees." "Why not?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Jack turned to her, his face pale. "Because the forest is their prison, and if we'd stayed any longer, it would have been ours too." That night, as they sat in Jack's cabin, the weight of what they'd experienced hung heavy in the air. "What was that?" Mark asked, his voice shaking. Jack lit a cigarette, his hands trembling. "I told you. The same thing the Harpers heard. Whatever's in these mountains, it's not human." Sarah stared at the locket in her hand, her mind racing. "We're not done. I have to go back." Jack's eyes darkened. "If you go back, you might not come out." Sarah didn't respond. For her, the mystery was only beginning.
Thanks for tuning into the Shiver Files. Your support means the world to us. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss a chilling new upload. We've got more spine-tingling stories coming your way, so stay tuned. See you in the next one, and until then, stay curious, stay brave, and stay shivering.